Ethan Walker sat in the corner booth of the rundown diner, staring blankly at his empty coffee cup. The once successful millionaire had hit rock bottom, his empire crumbled, leaving him with nothing but memories of a life he couldn't get back. As he lifted his eyes, a waitress walked over with a hesitant smile. Something about her seemed familiar. He squinted at her name tag, Lily. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be? His childhood love, Lily Evans, from the small town he had left behind so long ago? Ethan's life had been a series of calculated risks and bold moves. For years, everything he touched turned to gold. He was known for his real estate empire in New York, his flashy cars, his penthouse overlooking Central Park. But, in a cruel twist of fate, the 2008 financial crisis wiped out everything he had worked for. His closest friends turned their backs on him. Investors pulled out, and soon enough, Ethan was left with nothing but debts. He had no choice but to return to the quiet suburbs of his youth, a place he had long sworn never to revisit. Now, sitting in the dingy diner, Ethan's mind wandered back to the life he had built and lost. He could barely recognize the man in the mirror anymore. Unshaven, tired, broke, not a trace of the cocky businessman remained. The town, with its sleepy streets and old buildings, felt suffocating, but he couldn't afford to be anywhere else. The bell above the diner's door jingled as a new customer entered, but Ethan didn't bother to look up. He was too lost in his thoughts until the soft voice of the waitress broke through his reverie. "Refill?" He glanced up, forcing a polite smile. Her face was half hidden by a loose strand of hair that escaped her ponytail, but there was something about her that tugged at a buried memory. As she poured his coffee, he caught sight of her name tag. Lily. A name so common, but his heart faltered. He hadn't thought of her in years. Not since they were kids, sneaking out to the lake, laughing under the stars, sharing dreams of a future they thought would never change. But life had pulled them in opposite directions. Ethan toward success, and Lily, well, he had no idea what had become of her after he left. Ethan tried to shake the thought. There was no way this could be the same Lily. The world wasn't that small, was it? Still, he couldn't resist asking, his voice rough from years of emotional isolation. Lily? Evans? She stopped mid-pour, her hand trembling slightly as her eyes met his for the first time. Her expression was unreadable, but her silence said enough. Ethan knew in that moment, this wasn't just any waitress, it was her. A flood of memories crashed over him, memories of a simpler time, before ambition and greed had led him astray. What was she doing here, working in a diner? And why hadn't she left this small town like he had? But more importantly, how had he let her slip away? Ethan stared at Lily, the weight of the years pressing down on him. She looked different, older, of course, with faint lines of time tracing her face, but that spark, the one he remembered from all those summers ago, still flickered in her eyes. 1,000 questions swirled in his mind, but none made it to his lips. Lily hesitated for a moment before straightening up. Her face revealed nothing, but her hands shook as she placed the coffee pot back on the table. She glanced at him once more, her eyes searching his, but then, just like that, she was gone, disappearing into the back of the diner. Ethan's heart raced. What were the chances? Of all the people, in all the places, it had to be her. His chest tightened, the familiar feelings of regret and longing surfacing like an old wound. He thought he had buried those emotions years ago, but seeing her again, after all this time, brought everything rushing back. Ethan and Lily had grown up in the same small town, but their worlds had always been different. She was the girl next door, kind, compassionate, always dreaming of far-off places. He was the restless boy, ambitious and eager to escape. They'd spent countless nights together, lying under the stars, talking about the future, hers full of hope, his full of hunger for success. He promised her he'd take her with him, that once he made it big, they'd travel the world together. But promises are easy to make, and even easier to break. When the opportunity to move to New York came, Ethan didn't hesitate. He left the town, and Lily, behind without a second thought, too focused on building his empire to look back. He assumed she'd find her own path, maybe even someone better suited for her simple, gentle nature. But now, seeing her waiting tables in this forgotten diner, Ethan couldn't help but wonder, had she stayed here all this time, and why? As the minutes ticked by, Ethan grew restless. He needed to know more. He looked around the diner. Most of the other tables were empty, save for a couple of regulars engrossed in their meals. He spotted Lily at the counter, her back to him, refilling another customer's drink. He stood up, his legs feeling heavier than they should as he walked toward her. "Lily," he said softly when he was close enough. She turned, her eyes widening in surprise, though she quickly masked it. "Ethan," she replied, her voice steady, but there was a tightness there, a restraint. "You remember me?" It was a foolish question, but it was all he could think to say. "Hard to forget," she said, her eyes dropping to the floor. There was a pause, thick with unspoken words and unshed emotions. Ethan swallowed. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." She shrugged, her lips twitching into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Small towns tend to keep people around. But you? I thought you were long gone. New York, right?" He nodded, feeling the weight of his past decisions settle heavily on his shoulders. "Yeah, for a while, but things didn't turn out like I planned." The words tasted bitter in his mouth. Ethan had never been one to admit failure, but with Lily it felt inevitable. He couldn't pretend anymore. Lily's eyes flicked to the empty seat at the counter. "You can sit if you want. I've got a few minutes before my shift ends." Ethan nodded and slid onto the stool, suddenly unsure of himself. He'd faced boardrooms full of cutthroat executives, negotiated million-dollar deals, but sitting across from Lily now felt more intimidating than any of that. She set down the coffee pot and leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "So what brings you back? I thought you had everything you wanted in the city." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. "I did, or at least I thought I did. But everything fell apart. The market crashed, my business went under. I lost it all." Lily's expression softened, though her guard remained up. "I'm sorry to hear that, Ethan." "Thanks," he muttered, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. He glanced at her, noticing the way she avoided meeting his gaze for too long. "And you? You stayed here all this time?" Lily shrugged again, but this time there was a hint of something in her eyes. Pain, maybe, or regret. "Yeah, life doesn't always go as planned." For a moment, silence settled between them, heavy and full of everything they weren't saying. Ethan wanted to ask her more, to know what had kept her here, why she hadn't left like they always dreamed. But the words caught in his throat. He wasn't sure he had the right to ask anymore. Before he could figure out what to say next, Lily glanced at the clock on the wall. "I've got to finish up in the back, but it was good seeing you, Ethan. Take care of yourself." And just like that, she walked away again, leaving Ethan alone at the counter, staring after her with a mixture of guilt and longing. As Ethan watched her disappear into the kitchen, he felt an overwhelming sense of loss. Not just for the fortune he'd squandered or the life he once had, but for something much deeper, something he hadn't realized he was missing until this very moment, the chance to make things right. But the question remained, was it too late? Ethan sat in his car outside the diner, the engine idling but unmoving. The rain had started, gentle at first, but now it drummed steadily against the windshield, blurring his view of the diner's neon sign flickering in the darkness. He hadn't wanted to leave, not like that, but what could he say? Sorry for abandoning you? Sorry for thinking money was more important than the one person who ever really knew me? He clenched the steering wheel tighter. It had been years, decades even, since he'd thought about her, really thought about her. Now, she was all he could think about. Was this fate? Some cosmic joke? The boy who ran away from everything he knew to chase a dream, now back in the same place he started, with nothing to his name except regrets. Inside the diner, he'd seen it in her eyes. The same Lily, but different. Stronger perhaps, but guarded, distant. The Lily he'd known had been open, easy to laugh, always full of dreams and hopes for the future. The woman he'd spoken to was holding something back, and Ethan had a sinking feeling it was because of him. Hours passed and the rain only intensified. He hadn't moved an inch. Just as he was about to start the car and drive away, the back door of the diner creaked open. Ethan's breath caught as he saw her, umbrella in hand, stepping into the rain. She walked slowly, her head down, her expression pensive. His fingers itched to roll down the window, call out to her, anything to bridge the gap. But something stopped him. Fear. Fear of what she might say. Fear that maybe he had missed his chance. Lily didn't notice him as she walked past his car. she crossed the street and turned the corner, disappearing into the night. Ethan hesitated for a beat, then threw the car into gear and followed her, keeping a careful distance. He wasn't sure what he was doing. Stalking her wasn't exactly part of the plan, but something about the way she walked, the loneliness in her posture, compelled him to know more. After a few minutes, she stopped at a small apartment complex. It wasn't much, just a 2-story building with peeling paint and a flickering porch light. Lily paused at the door, fumbling with her keys, before stepping inside and closing it behind her. Ethan parked a few houses down, his mind racing. What had happened to her? What had kept her here all these years, in this rundown town, working at a diner? He had always imagined Lily would leave, that she'd follow her dreams. She'd always talked about traveling, seeing the world. So why was she still here? Ethan leaned back in his seat, staring at her apartment. He could just walk away. He could leave tonight, drive back to the city, and forget this place ever existed. It would be easier that way. But deep down, he knew he wouldn't. He couldn't. Something was drawing him back to her, and it wasn't just the guilt. The next morning, Ethan returned to the diner, his heart thudding with uncertainty. He hadn't slept. He spent the night replaying every word, every glance between them, over and over in his mind. It had been years since they'd spoken, but the distance between them felt larger than time. He needed to understand what had happened. More than that, he needed to know if he still had a place in her life. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and the familiar smell of coffee and greasy breakfast filled the air. It was quieter than the night before. The few customers scattered at tables barely looked up from their plates as he walked in. Lily was behind the counter, taking an order from a regular. She didn't see him at first, but when she did, her expression froze for a brief moment before she quickly looked away, focusing on the customer's request. Ethan sat down at the same booth, but this time his nervousness was palpable. Would she come over? Would she ignore him? He didn't know what he'd say if she did come. A few minutes later, Lily walked over, her face calm but distant. "Back again?" she asked, her tone neutral. "I couldn't leave it like that," Ethan said, trying to meet her eyes, but she kept them focused on the notepad in her hand. "We didn't really get a chance to talk last night." Lily sighed, glancing around the empty diner before sitting across from him. She looked exhausted, like the weight of their past was pressing down on her just as much as it was on him. "Ethan, what do you want? It's been, 15 years? 20? You don't owe me anything, and I don't owe you an explanation." Her words stung, but he didn't flinch. He had expected this. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I couldn't leave without knowing why you stayed here." Lily's eyes flashed with something. Anger, maybe, or frustration. "What do you care? You left. You got your big life in the city. You didn't look back." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan swallowed, unsure how to explain something he had never fully understood himself. "I was young, stupid. I thought I had to leave to prove something. I thought I needed to make it on my own, but I lost more than I gained." Lily shook her head, her voice quieter now. "You're not the only one who lost something." That cut deeper than he expected. "Lily, I didn't know. If I could go back, I would have." She cut him off, her eyes narrowing. "You would have what? Stayed?" "No, you wouldn't have. You were always going to leave, Ethan. That's who you are." The words stung because they were true. He had always been running, always chasing after something more. But for the first time, he wasn't sure what that more was. Ethan leaned forward, his voice softer now. "I didn't know what I was losing until it was too late, and now I just want to understand." Lily looked away, her eyes distant. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then with a sigh, she said, "You really want to know why I stayed?" Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. She took a deep breath, her voice heavy with emotion. "Because I didn't have a choice." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. No choice? What did that mean? Ethan's mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. He wanted to ask more, but the look on her face stopped him. There was pain there, a deep, unresolved hurt that he couldn't pry open without making it worse. Lily stood up, her hands shaking slightly as she gathered the notepad and pen. "Look, Ethan, I have to get back to work. Whatever you're looking for, I can't give it to you. Not anymore." He watched her walk away, a hollow feeling settling in his chest. There was something she wasn't telling him, something big. And whatever it was, it had kept her here, trapped in this small town, while he had run off to chase his dreams. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became to find out what had really happened. But first, he needed her to trust him again. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. Lily's last words had echoed in his mind all night. I didn't have a choice. It didn't make sense. Lily had always been the most independent, determined person he knew. The kind of woman who could carve her own path, no matter what. What could have possibly held her back? The following day, Ethan found himself once again parked outside the diner. It was mid-morning now, the sun high in the sky casting a warm glow over the small town. But inside, Ethan felt cold, weighed down by the unknown swirling around him. He was no longer just chasing closure. Now he was chasing answers. As Lily worked her shift, she moved through the diner with her usual quiet efficiency, but there was a tension in the air between them. She had been distant before, but now she barely looked his way. Ethan could sense that she wanted to avoid any more uncomfortable conversations. But he wasn't ready to leave, not yet. When the lunch rush ended and the diner emptied out, Ethan saw his chance. He approached the counter cautiously, unsure if Lily would even talk to him. Lily, he started, his voice soft, I'm sorry for pushing you yesterday. I can't leave without understanding what happened. Lily didn't respond at first. She wiped down the counter, her movements deliberate, as though she was trying to decide whether to say anything at all. Finally, she sighed, leaning on the counter, but she still didn't meet his eyes. You really want to know, Ethan? She asked quietly, her voice carrying the weight of years of silence. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. I do. Lily set down the rag she was holding and stared out the window, her expression distant. After you left, things weren't easy. Not for me. I tried to move on, tried to forget, but this place, it has a way of pulling people back. My family needed me, and I didn't have the luxury of running off to chase dreams like you did. Ethan felt a pang of guilt. He had left without looking back, while Lily had stayed to shoulder responsibilities he hadn't even known about. I didn't know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily turned to him then, her eyes sharp. Of course you didn't know. You didn't ask. You left, Ethan. You left without a word, and I had to pick up the pieces. Ethan opened his mouth to apologize, but Lily wasn't done. You want to know why I stayed? She asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Because after you left, I found out I was pregnant. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. Pregnant? Lily's eyes were full of a pain that Ethan couldn't even begin to understand. I didn't tell you because I knew you wouldn't come back. You were too focused on your life, your success. I didn't want to be the thing that held you back. Ethan stared at her, his mind reeling. Pregnant. His world spun as he tried to make sense of the words. He had been gone, living his life, chasing dreams, while Lily had been here, alone, raising a child he never knew existed. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. Ethan couldn't find the words. His chest felt tight, his hands trembling as he tried to process what she had just told him. He had a child he had never met, never even knew about. Where? He couldn't even finish the question. Lily's face softened, the anger giving way to something more vulnerable. She's 10 now. Her name's Emma. She's in school right now. Emma. A daughter. The realization hit Ethan like a freight train. All these years, he had thought the only thing he'd lost was a relationship, a connection to his past. But now he knew it was so much more. He had missed his daughter's entire childhood. I didn't know, Lily, he stammered, his voice shaking. I had no idea. Lily nodded, but there was no comfort in her eyes. I know, and I didn't tell you because I knew you wouldn't stay. You made your choice when you left. Ethan felt like he was drowning. The life he had lived, the choices he had made, all felt meaningless now in the face of this new reality. He had a child, and he had never been there for her. I want to meet her, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. I want to be part of her life. Lily shook her head, her expression guarded. It's not that simple, Ethan. You can't just walk back in and expect everything to be okay. I've spent years raising her on my own. You don't know what we've been through. Ethan swallowed hard, guilt and regret twisting in his chest. I know I can't change the past, but I want to make things right. Please, Lily, let me meet her. Lily hesitated, clearly torn. She looked away, biting her lip as she weighed her options. Finally, she nodded, but her expression remained cautious. "I'll think about it. But don't get your hopes up. Emma doesn't know about you, and I'm not sure how she'll react." Ethan's heart raced. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. It was a chance, one he wasn't sure he deserved, but one he was willing to fight for. The days that followed were some of the longest Ethan had ever experienced. He stayed in the small town, renting a cheap motel room just outside of the main strip, waiting anxiously for Lily's decision. Every day felt like an eternity, and every time his phone buzzed, his heart leaped, hoping it was her. Meanwhile, Ethan's thoughts were consumed by his daughter. He tried to imagine what she looked like, what kind of person she was, but all he could do was guess. Would she have Lily's eyes, her kindness? Would she resent him for never being there? One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the streets, his phone rang. It was Lily. "Can you meet me at the park?" she asked, her voice calm but with an underlying tension. Ethan's pulse quickened. "Yeah, of course." 15 minutes later, he was standing in the town's small park, the playground empty except for a few children playing in the distance. He spotted Lily sitting on a bench, her posture stiff, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Next to her was a little girl with sandy brown hair, her legs swinging off the bench as she focused intently on a book in her hands. "Emma." Ethan's heart raced as he approached, his palms sweating. Lily looked up as he got closer, giving him a small nod. "This is Emma," she said softly. Emma glanced up from her book, her eyes curious but cautious. She had Lily's eyes, Ethan realized, that same spark he had fallen in love with all those years ago. "Hi, Emma," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm Ethan." The little girl frowned slightly, tilting her head as if trying to figure something out. "Hi," she said slowly. Then she turned back to her book. Lily gave Ethan an apologetic look as if to say, "Don't expect too much." Ethan sat down on the bench, feeling awkward and out of place. He wanted to say so much, to explain, to tell Emma everything. But he knew it wasn't that simple. So he sat in silence, watching her, wondering how he could possibly make up for all the lost time. The playground was filled with the laughter of children, their bright voices a stark contrast to the tension sitting between Ethan, Lily, and Emma on the bench. Emma had gone back to her book, her small legs still swinging rhythmically beneath her. Ethan's heart ached to say something, anything, to bridge the gap between them, but the words stuck in his throat. "Emma," he finally managed, his voice quiet and uncertain, "what are you reading?" Emma didn't look up. She flipped a page, her little brows furrowed in concentration. "It's about animals," she said simply. Ethan smiled, though his nerves still prickled. "I used to love reading about animals when I was a kid. What's your favorite?" Emma paused, thinking for a moment. "Tigers," she said. "They're strong, and they don't let anybody mess with them." Lily shot Ethan a glance, one that carried a subtle warning. "Take it slow. Don't push." Ethan nodded, understanding. He wanted to tell Emma that he was proud of her, that he couldn't believe how smart and strong she was, but he knew he had no right to say any of that. Not yet. For now, he had to be content with just being near her, getting to know her bit by bit, and he had to hope that somehow, someday, she'd let him in. Lily sat beside Ethan, her body stiff with unease. She had never imagined this day would come. Ethan, back in their lives, trying to reconnect with the daughter he never knew he had. A part of her had dreaded it for years. Another part of her had wanted it too, but only because Emma deserved to know where she came from. Lily had built a life for herself and her daughter without Ethan. It wasn't glamorous or easy, but it was theirs. She had always been honest with Emma about most things, except for this, except for why her father was never there. How could she explain it to a little girl who asked, year after year, where her daddy was? Now, with Ethan sitting beside her, trying to bond with Emma, it all felt surreal. She had once loved this man with all her heart, and now here they were, two strangers connected by the life of the girl sitting between them. "You're doing okay," Lily whispered to Ethan when Emma became absorbed in her book again. Ethan looked at her, his expression a mixture of relief and doubt. "I'm not sure I even know what I'm doing," Lily nodded. "Neither do I, but we'll figure it out." Ethan gave a small, grateful smile. It was the first moment of understanding they had shared since he came back. And though the road ahead seemed impossibly long, Lily knew this was a step forward. Days passed, and little by little, Ethan found ways to be near Emma. He showed up at the diner during her school breaks, sitting at the counter while Lily worked, chatting with Emma as she did her homework or doodled in a notebook. Sometimes they sat in silence. Other times they talked about small things, her school, her friends, her favorite games. It wasn't much, but it was something. Emma didn't warm up to him right away. She was polite, cautious, always keeping a distance. But Ethan noticed the small changes over time. She started answering his questions more openly. She'd share a fact about the animals she loved or talk about a game she was playing. And once, just once, she smiled at one of his silly jokes. Ethan cherished those moments, no matter how fleeting, but he knew this was just the beginning. Building a relationship with his daughter would take time, a lot of time. He'd missed the first 10 years of her life. He couldn't expect to make up for all of it in a few conversations. But the more time he spent with Emma, the more he felt a deep, aching need to be there for her, to be the father she deserved. And yet, the shadow of his absence loomed large. One evening, after weeks of tentative interactions, Ethan was sitting on the steps outside his motel, staring at his phone. He had tried to keep his business contacts alive during his time in the small town. But the truth was, his life in New York felt like a distant memory now. His old colleagues had moved on, and there were fewer and fewer reasons for him to return to the city. The life he had built there no longer seemed to matter as much. The door to his motel room creaked open, and Ethan looked up to see Lily standing there, holding a small piece of paper in her hand. She looked nervous, as if she had been thinking about something for a while. "I've been talking with Emma," she said slowly, "and I think she's ready to spend more time with you. But I need you to understand something, Ethan." Ethan stood, the weight of her words sinking in. "Anything," he said, his voice low but firm. Lily stepped closer, her eyes locking with his. "This isn't just about you and me anymore. Emma's been through a lot, and she's just starting to get comfortable with the idea of you being around. If you leave again, if you hurt her, there's no going back." Ethan nodded, guilt twisting in his gut. He had already caused enough damage by leaving once. He couldn't make that mistake again. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice filled with conviction. Lily handed him the piece of paper. It was a hand-drawn map. "Tomorrow's Saturday," she said. "Emma likes to go hiking near the lake. She asked if you wanted to come." Ethan's chest tightened. He took the map, his hands trembling slightly. "I'd love that." Lily gave him a small nod, then turned to leave. But before she did, she paused. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft, "thank you for trying." He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, watching as she disappeared into the night. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the lake just after sunrise. The mist hung low over the water, and the trees around them swayed gently in the breeze. Emma was already there, sitting on a rock near the shore, skipping stones across the surface. She looked up when she saw him, her expression still guarded, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "Hey," Ethan said, walking over to her. He crouched down, picking up a stone and mimicking her movement, skipping it across the water. Emma didn't say anything at first, but after a while she handed him a larger rock. "Try this one," she said. Ethan took the rock, smiling at the small act of trust. "Thanks." They spent the next hour walking along the lake, talking about nothing in particular. Emma showed him the best spots to skip stones and pointed out where she had once seen a deer drinking from the water. Ethan listened intently, soaking in every detail, grateful for every second he spent with her. Eventually, they sat down on a fallen log, watching the sunlight dance across the surface of the lake. Emma was quiet, her small hands resting in her lap. Ethan sensed that something was on her mind, but he didn't want to push her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Emma spoke. "Mom says you used to live far away." Ethan nodded. "I did. In New York." Emma kicked at the dirt beneath her feet, her eyes downcast. "Why did you leave?" Ethan's throat tightened. This was the question he had been dreading, the one he didn't have a good answer for. "I was chasing something," he said carefully. "Something I thought I needed, but I didn't realize how much I was leaving behind." Emma looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for something. Truth, maybe, or understanding. "Will you leave again?" The question hung in the air like a heavy weight. Ethan swallowed hard, his heart breaking at the thought of disappointing her again. "No," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't leave again. I promise." Emma didn't say anything, but she nodded, accepting his words for now. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. As the days passed, Ethan's presence in Emma's life became more constant. He showed up at the diner during her after-school hours, sometimes helping her with homework or sitting quietly while she sketched in her notebook. Their bond was fragile but growing, slowly, tentatively. Ethan knew that every step forward was a gift, but with each new connection came the fear of breaking it all again. One Saturday morning, as the crisp autumn air began to sweep through the town, Ethan decided to take Emma to the local pumpkin patch. It was something Lily used to do with her every year, and Ethan hoped it would become a new tradition for the three of them. The patch was bustling with families picking out pumpkins, children laughing as they ran through corn mazes and tried to lift the largest gourds they could find. Ethan glanced at Emma, hoping the fun of the day would help ease the tension that still lingered between them. Lily had been hesitant at first to let them go without her, but eventually she had agreed, telling Ethan she needed some time to herself. Ethan understood. She had been carrying the weight of raising Emma alone for so long. She needed space to process his sudden reappearance in their lives, and he respected that. At the patch, Ethan and Emma wandered through rows of pumpkins, the bright orange sea around them stretching as far as they could see. Emma stayed close to Ethan, her eyes scanning the field, but there was still a guardedness in her demeanor. She hadn't quite let her walls down, and Ethan knew it would take time. As they walked, Ethan tried to make conversation. "So, how do you pick the best pumpkin?" Emma looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "You have to knock on it. If it sounds hollow, it's good." Ethan grinned. "Smart. Let's test a few." They spent the next hour wandering through the patch, tapping on pumpkins, inspecting their shapes, and laughing at the strange misshapen ones. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan saw a flicker of light in Emma's eyes, a glimpse of the girl she might have been if he had been there all along. It was bittersweet, knowing he had missed so much, but he was determined to make up for lost time. They found a perfect pumpkin, round, bright, and hollow-sounding, just as Emma had predicted. Ethan hoisted it onto his shoulder, and they made their way to the checkout. As they stood in line, waiting to pay, Ethan felt a tug on his sleeve. He looked down to see Emma, her face serious. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. "Of course," Ethan replied, his heart thudding. "Why didn't you come sooner?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He had been bracing for it, knowing it was only a matter of time before Emma asked. But now that it was here, he wasn't sure how to answer. How could he explain the choices he had made, the selfish pursuit of success that had blinded him to what really mattered? Ethan crouched down to Emma's level, setting the pumpkin down beside him. "I made some mistakes," he said slowly, trying to find the right words. "When I left, I thought I had to go after something big. I thought that was the only way to make a good life. But I was wrong, Emma. I was so wrong. I should have been here for you and your mom. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Emma stared at him, her eyes wide and searching. "Do you really mean it?" Ethan's chest tightened. "With all my heart. I wish I could go back and change things, but I can't. All I can do now is be here and do my best to make things right." For a moment, Emma didn't respond. Ethan's pulse quickened, fear gnawing at him. What if this was it? What if he had lost her for good? But then, slowly, Emma nodded. "Okay," she said softly. Ethan blinked, relief flooding through him. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely, but it was something. It was a start. Back at the diner, Lily stood behind the counter, her hands gripping the edge of the stainless steel surface as she stared out the window. She had been watching the clock, waiting for Ethan and Emma to return from the pumpkin patch, but her mind was somewhere else. Ethan's return had stirred up feelings she thought she had buried long ago. Feelings of anger, betrayal, and abandonment, but also feelings of love. Once upon a time, she had loved him fiercely. They had been inseparable, two kids dreaming of a life beyond their small town. But when he left, that dream had shattered. Lily had been forced to pick up the pieces, to build a life for herself and Emma without him. And yet, now that he was back, those old feelings had started to resurface. She hated it, but she couldn't deny the truth. Seeing Ethan with Emma stirred something deep inside her. The way he was trying, the way he looked at Emma with such tenderness, such regret, it made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to move forward. But then, there was the fear. The fear that if she let him in again, he would hurt her, hurt them both. And that was something Lily couldn't allow. Not again. Later that evening, Ethan dropped Emma off at Lily's apartment. They had spent the afternoon carving the pumpkin they'd picked out, laughing as they tried to make the scariest face possible. It had been a good day, one of the best Ethan had experienced in years. But as he walked Emma to the door, reality came crashing back down. When Lily opened the door, her eyes softened at the sight of Emma carrying the carved pumpkin proudly in her arms. "Look, Mom," Emma beamed. "We made a jack-o'-lantern." Lily smiled, her heart swelling at the sight of her daughter's happiness. "It looks great, sweetheart." Ethan stood awkwardly at the doorstep, unsure of what to say. He wanted to stay, to be part of their evening, but he knew he didn't belong here. Not yet. "Thanks for letting me take her today," he said, his voice low. Lily nodded. She had a good time. There was an uncomfortable silence as the weight of their shared history settled between them. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat. "Lily, I know I have no right to ask this, but I don't want to just be a part-time dad. I want to be here for Emma, really be here, and I know that's going to take time, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Lily met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. She wanted to believe him, but she had been burned before. "You can't just walk back into our lives and expect everything to be okay, Ethan," she said softly. "Emma deserves more than that." "I know," Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking for a chance to make things right." Lily hesitated, her heart pounding. She had spent so many years protecting Emma from the pain of abandonment, from the disappointment of not having a father. But now that Ethan was back, she wasn't sure what to do. Could she trust him? Could she open herself up to the possibility of letting him be a part of their lives again? "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. "That's all I'm asking." Days turned into weeks, and Ethan continued to show up. He didn't push, didn't demand more than Lily or Emma were willing to give. He spent time with Emma whenever Lily allowed it, gradually becoming a more permanent presence in her life. They visited the library, went on hikes by the lake, and even helped out at the diner on slow days. But just as things began to settle into a rhythm, a new obstacle emerged, one that would test everything Ethan had worked for. One afternoon, as Ethan was leaving the diner after lunch with Emma, his phone buzzed. He glanced down and saw an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. Hesitant, he answered. The voice on the other end was one he hadn't heard in years. "Ethan? It's Doug, from the firm. We've been looking for you." Ethan's stomach tightened. The firm, his old life. He had almost forgotten about Doug, his former business partner. "Doug, what do you want?" "There's an opportunity," Doug said, his voice excited. "A huge real estate development on the West Coast. They're looking for investors, and I've got a foot in the door. This could be it, Ethan, the comeback we've been waiting for." Ethan's heart pounded. For a moment, he was transported back to his old life. The thrill of the deal, the rush of success. It was everything he had wanted. Once. "I'm not interested," Ethan said, his voice firm. Doug sounded surprised. "You're not interested? Are you kidding me? This is what we worked for." "I have a daughter now," Ethan said quietly. "My life's here." Doug laughed, the sound harsh and dismissive. "Come on, Ethan. You're not really going to throw away everything for some small-town life, are you? You were meant for bigger things." Ethan's jaw clenched. "I've already thrown away enough," he said. "I'm not making that mistake again." He hung up the phone, his hands shaking. The decision was clear, but the weight of it still settled heavily on his shoulders. This was the moment. The test. Ethan had been chasing success for so long that walking away from it felt like letting go of a part of himself. But he knew, deep down, that if he went back to that life, he would lose everything again. He would lose Emma. He would lose Lily. And this time, there would be no coming back. That night, Ethan sat outside Lily's apartment, waiting. He had made his decision, but he needed Lily to know. He needed her to understand that this time, he wasn't running away. When she opened the door, her expression cautious, Ethan stood. "Lily, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice steady. "I got a call today. An old business partner. He offered me a chance to go back to my old life, back to New York." Lily's eyes widened, her breath catching. And I told him no," Ethan said, his voice soft but resolute. "I told him I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, Lily just stared at him, her emotions swirling behind her eyes. She had spent so many years preparing herself for disappointment, for the day when Ethan would leave again. But now, hearing him say those words, something inside her shifted. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes locking with hers. "Because I'm not that man anymore, Lily. I don't want the life I had. I want this. I want you. I want Emma. I'm not running anymore." Tears welled in Lily's eyes, and she blinked them away, trying to keep her composure. She had heard promises before, but this time, she believed him. Ethan reached out, gently taking her hand. "I know I can't change the past, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Lily looked up at him, her heart full, the weight of the past slowly lifting from her shoulders. "I believe you," she whispered. In that moment, standing on the doorstep of the life they could have had, Ethan and Lily finally let go of the pain that had held them apart for so long. And in its place, something new began to grow: hope. In the weeks that followed, things began to change for Ethan, Lily, and Emma. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic shift, but a gradual, steady build, like the slow thaw of winter giving way to spring. Ethan's presence in Emma's life became more than just visits or outings. He became a real part of her routine, helping her with homework after school, driving her to soccer practice, and even sitting with her at the kitchen table as they shared meals. For the first time, Ethan felt a sense of belonging that he had never known before. The chaos of his old life in New York seemed like a distant memory. The suits, the deals, the high-stakes meetings, they didn't matter anymore. What mattered was right here, in this small town, with the two people who had become his world. For Lily, letting Ethan back into her life wasn't easy. Years of hurt and abandonment couldn't be undone overnight, and though she had begun to trust him again, she still had her reservations. There were moments when she caught herself doubting, wondering if this new version of Ethan was real or just temporary. But every time those doubts crept in, Ethan would prove her wrong. One evening, after a long day at the diner, Lily came home to find Ethan sitting on the living room floor with Emma. They were going over a school project Emma had been working on, something about tigers, her favorite animal, and Ethan was listening intently as Emma explained each detail with enthusiasm. Lily stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them. She had spent so many years doing this alone, carrying the weight of raising Emma by herself, that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone share that burden. Seeing Ethan there, with Emma, made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't the sharp, painful ache of old wounds, but something softer, something like hope. Later that night, after Emma had gone to bed, Ethan and Lily sat together on the couch. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Lily glanced at Ethan, her heart still guarded, but slowly opening. "Emma's really starting to come around," she said softly, her fingers playing with the edge of a throw pillow. Ethan smiled, his gaze distant as he thought about his daughter. "She's incredible, Lily. I can't believe I missed so much." Lily nodded, her own feelings of regret surfacing. "It wasn't easy, but you're here now, and that's what matters." Ethan looked at her then, his expression serious. "I don't want to just be in Emma's life. I want to be in yours too." Lily's heart skipped a beat. She had known this conversation was coming, but hearing the words made it real. "Ethan, I know I hurt you," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I left you when I shouldn't have, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I'm here now, and I want to be here, for both of you." Lily bit her lip, her eyes welling with tears. She had spent so many years building walls around her heart, walls that had protected her from the pain of losing Ethan. But now, standing on the edge of something new, she wasn't sure if she was ready to let those walls come down. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan reached for her hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. "I am too. But we've both changed, Lily, and I think we can build something better this time. Lily looked at him, her defenses slowly crumbling. She had spent so long protecting herself, but now, with Ethan looking at her like this, with love, with regret, with hope, she realized that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. She squeezed his hand, her heart pounding in her chest. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's try." The next big step in Ethan's journey came on a crisp November afternoon. The three of them, Ethan, Lily, and Emma, had gone to the park for a walk, something they had started doing regularly as a way to spend more time together. Emma had become more comfortable with Ethan, but there was still a lingering distance. She would laugh with him, talk to him, but there was always a part of her that held back, unsure of what to expect. That day, as they walked by the lake, Emma slowed her pace, falling behind her parents. Ethan noticed and turned back, concern flickering across his face. "Everything okay, Em?" Emma stopped, kicking at the gravel beneath her feet. She looked up at Ethan, her eyes searching his face, as if she were trying to make a decision. "Are you going to stay?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Ethan felt his heart twist at the question. He crouched down to her level, meeting her gaze head-on. "I'm not going anywhere, Emma. I'm here to stay." Emma bit her lip, her eyes welling with tears. "But what if you change your mind? What if you leave again?" Ethan swallowed hard, guilt and regret twisting inside him. "I'm not going to leave, Em. I promise you that. I'm here for good." For a long moment, Emma just stared at him, her expression unreadable. But then, slowly, she took a step forward and wrapped her small arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he held her close, his own tears threatening to spill over. It was the first time Emma had ever hugged him, the first time she had let him in fully. And in that moment, Ethan knew that everything he had been fighting for, everything he had worked to rebuild, had been worth it. "I love you, Dad," Emma whispered into his shoulder. Ethan's heart swelled, and he blinked back tears as he whispered back, "I love you too, Em, so much." Lily stood a few feet away, watching the scene unfold with tears in her own eyes. This was it. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. The moment when everything started to heal. For the first time in years, she felt like they could truly be a family. As the months passed, the bond between Ethan, Lily, and Emma grew stronger. They began to carve out a life together. One filled with shared laughter, trust, and the quiet moments that made up a real family. Ethan found work in the town, something simple but meaningful, and Lily's diner became a second home for them. Emma thrived in school, and the joy she once carried as a child started to shine through again. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of Lily's apartment watching the sun set over the horizon, Ethan looked at Lily, his heart full of gratitude and love. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he said softly, his hand resting on hers. Lily smiled, nodding as she looked out at the fading light. "We have, and I'm glad we did." Ethan leaned over, kissing her gently on the forehead. "I don't know what I did to deserve a second chance with you and Emma, but I'm not going to waste it." Lily looked at him, her eyes filled with warmth and understanding. "We're not looking at the past anymore, Ethan. We're building something new, together." And in that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a soft golden glow, Ethan knew that this life with Lily and Emma, was the life he had been searching for all along. Months later, as winter began to blanket the town in snow, Ethan, Lily, and Emma sat around their small kitchen table, laughing over cups of hot cocoa. The walls of their past had finally crumbled, and in their place stood something stronger, something that would last. Ethan had learned the hard way that success didn't come from wealth or power. It came from the people you loved, the family you built, and the moments you shared. As he looked at Lily and Emma, he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. No longer the man who had run away, Ethan had finally come home, and this time he wasn't leaving. The story of Ethan, Lily, and Emma had been one of loss, regret, and pain, but also of love, forgiveness, and second chances. In the end, they found their way back to each other, not by erasing the past, but by embracing it and building something new together. Their future was still unfolding, but now they faced it as a family, stronger, wiser, and full of hope. If you thought this story was intriguing, Just wait until you learn more about the mysterious woman who saved Nick Carlisle from total ruin. Who is she really? And why did she ask not to be found? Click on the video popping up on your screen now to find out what Nick does next in the suspense-filled story.